We have seen the solutions for linear hyperbolic system. Also, we tried to develop the theory for nonlinear hyperbolic systems. So we'll sort of finish it and then we'll start CFD today. So as of now, for the nonlinear hyperbolic systems, uh, we have transformed the nonlinear system of hyperbolic equations into the characteristic form. We have transformed the equations in conservative form to characteristic form. The example for it was 1D Euler's system. So we had the equation 1D Euler's equations in conservative form. We transformed it to characteristic form, and I have written the characteristic form over here. We have seen this last time. So these are the characteristic variables: u minus 2a by gamma minus 1, s and u plus 2a by gamma minus 1. So these are moving along with the characteristics given by these things: u minus a, u and u plus a. That is dx by dt equals u minus a is the characteristic along which u minus 2a by gamma minus 1 is traveling. So this is the characteristic form. So now this is our diagonal matrix. We made the decoupled system. We made the coupled system of Euler's equations into a decoupled system. And that was our characteristic form. Then, yeah. And then, these equations A, B, and C, some of them are nonlinear and B is linear. So here A and C are nonlinear and B is linear. So when we solve nonlinear equations, we'll end up having shock waves and contact expansion waves. Whereas when we solve linear equations, we'll end up getting contact discontinuities. We'll see how these are being done. So first, let us see the nonlinear case, that is the equations A and C. So for these, for each of these equations A and C, consider each of them separately. That is, consider just this first equation along with the derivative, of course. Then the next equation is this. For each of these equations, you plot the characteristics. We have seen how to plot the characteristics for scalar conservation laws some time back. So for any nonlinear equation, these two equations are nonlinear. So slope of the characteristics are going to be functions of each initial point x naught. We have, so in the axis x, we have so many initial points, right? X naught. We have infinite number of initial points. So at each of x naught, you'll have different slope. So that is what is for a nonlinear equation. It happens so, because dx by dt equals a of u of x naught. So this is a function of x naught. So for at each of the points, you will have different slopes. So that is how you determine the characteristics. So since the slopes can be different at different points, they may either converge or diverge. So first I've shown diverging characteristics, where if you consider some point in the close neighbor regions, in the neighborhood of that point, the characteristics are diverging. Whereas if you consider this case, here the characteristics are converging to this point around here. So converging characteristics will lead to multiple solutions, and then it will eventually lead to formation of shock. So this will lead to shock formation, and this is the formation of expansion wave. Because the characteristics have different slope, we have expansion wave and shock waves forming. So this can happen only when the equations are nonlinear, because only when the equations are nonlinear, your slope is going to be a function of x naught. So in that case, your characteristics can either converge or diverge, or can just be parallel itself, depending on how the initial condition is, u of x naught is. Here a is a function of u of x naught, right? So if u is same for all of x naught, then of course for all of x naught the slope is going to be same. So it depends on the initial condition. So if u is different for different x naught, then the slope will be different for different x. Slope at each and every point will be different. Then that will lead to converging or diverging characteristics. If the slope is same, then they are going to be parallel only. The characteristics will be parallel. So when we have nonlinear equation, we may have converging, diverging, or parallel characteristics, depending on how the initial condition is, u of x naught is. Then, yeah, of course, we have seen this now. When the characteristics converge, it leads to shock formation, and when they diverge, we have expansion wave formation. So this is the case with nonlinear equations. That is, out in the Euler system of equations, two of our equations are nonlinear. If we decouple the Euler systems of equations, then we observe the scalar equations. Two of those are nonlinear and one is linear. Now we have seen the theory for nonlinear system. Now let's look at the linear system, that is equation B, where we have dou by dou t of s plus u dou by dou x of s equals 0. So this is our equation B, which is a linear equation, because here s is our variable and u dou by dou x of s. We have u dou by dou x of s, right? So u is not a function of s. So of course this is a constant with respect to s. So this equation is linear. So for a linear equation, you have dx, the equation for slope will be dx by dt equals u. So the characteristics are always going to be parallel. So because of this reason, whatever for a linear equation, the slopes of characteristics will always, the characteristics will always be parallel. Their slope is all same at all points. At all x naught, the slope is going to be the same. However, if the initial condition itself has a discontinuity, then that discontinuity can travel along the characteristics, or it can just remain steady if u is 0. If u is 0, then dx by dt equals 0, right? Then we'll have x equals some x naught, which is the initial point. So x will be constant. So we'll have just straight lines. So then if that is so, if your characteristics are just straight lines, then your initial condition will remain steady for all time. That is, if your characteristics are just some straight lines like this, if you have some initial condition, then that initial condition will remain along the characteristics. The value of u remains the same, right? So the initial profile will remain, is going to remain the same over time. As you evolve over time, the initial profile for you had, let's say you had some profile, and I'm doing this with respect to the u-axis, another u-axis. So let's say you're having such an initial profile, and this initial profile is going to travel, uh, is going to be the same along these blue characteristics, these lines, right? So this initial profile is going to remain the same for all time. That is, the solution remains steady. But if the characteristics are have some slope, if like these lines that I've drawn over here, if the characteristics have some slope, some angle with respect to x-axis instead of 90 degrees, then your initial profile is going to travel with over time in some direction. Let's since the characteristics are directed in this direction, the slope is somewhat like acute. Your initial profile is going to travel in the positive x direction. Suppose if your characteristics were like this, then your initial profile will travel in the negative x direction. I mean, all these we have seen when we were doing scalar conservation laws, so I'm not going into more details here. So yeah, we'll get traveling wave solutions, and we may also get steady solutions if your you know, the angle. Okay. if your characteristics are just straight lines with angles 90 degree. In that case, your solution will remain steady. So these are the two things. That is, when we transform your conservative form of Euler system of equation to characteristic form, we get to we get three separate equations that are decoupled. Each of them can be treated as separate scalar equations, and then we can solve each of them separately, and then we can combine them to get your full solution for the Euler system. So that is what we'll be seeing here. So we have seen how each of these solutions can give different types of solutions. Now let's see how the initial conditions can be. That is, how different kinds of initial conditions we can have. So initial conditions can be continuous and differentiable everywhere. That is one possibility. Or they may not be differentiable at all. I mean, they may be continuous everywhere and differentiable almost everywhere, but not at a point, but not at all points. So that means you may have some points where there is no differentiability. So you may have that case, or you may have a case in which differentiability does not exist only at a point, but everywhere else the function is differentiable. An example for that is a Riemann problem. We have seen Riemann problem earlier. That is, we identify some point in X, that is some specific point X naught in X, and at that point we'll introduce a discontinuity in your function, and to the left of that point you'll have a constant solution, and to the right of that constant value for u, and to the right of that discontinuity you will have some other constant for u. So that is your you had, right, so u at x comma t equals 0, that was ul and ur for x less than x naught and x greater than or equal to x naught. So this was your Riemann problem. So this satisfies this condition. So example for a function being not differentiable only at a single point is a Riemann problem. So these are some things which with respect to continuity and differentiability. Next we'll see some factors for having different initial conditions with respect to monotonicity. A monotonicity is something like your function is non-increasing or non-decreasing. I mean, you know what increasing and decreasing is. When you move from one point to the next point, your function also should increase. That is, you have some x and u. So you have 2 points. Your function value at this point is something over here. When you increase in the direction of x, your function also should increase. It should never decrease, or it should never be, it should never have the same value. That is, it should not be a straight line also. That is, between 2 points, when you move, your function value should not be the same also, and it should not decrease as well. It should always increase. That is known as an increasing function. An opposite of that is a decreasing function, that the function should always decrease. As you move in the positive x direction, the function should always decrease. On the other hand, when you see non-increasing and non-decreasing functions, non-decreasing allows for your function to increase or just be same. That is, this allows for your function to increase, and also it allows for your function to not change at all. That is, when you move between 2 points, your function value also remains the same, like this condition over here, like this one. When you move in a positive x direction, your function value remains the same. This is allowed, and increase of function is also allowed. That is a non-decreasing function. For a non-increasing function, decreasing is allowed and remaining same is allowed. So this is known as a monotonic function with respect to x. An example for this is again a Riemann problem, because in Riemann problem we had a discontinuity. We had ul and ur, something like this, right? This is the x-axis and this is your u-axis. So here your u is decreasing and it remains same. Both are happening. So this is a non-increasing function. On the other hand, you can have another function like this. This is ul and this is ur. This is a non-decreasing function. So yeah, this is what is meant by monotonicity of a function. Uh, this is one type of initial condition. Or we may have some initial condition in which there is no monotonicity. That is, in some functions, a function can either increase or decrease or do anything. So this is a non-monotonic function. This is some general function. Okay. These are some nice functions that we can treat, that this will help us in understanding the system better. These initial conditions, these are some special cases, so these will help us in understanding the system better. So we are considering these special initial conditions called monotonic. For monotonic initial conditions, Riemann problem is your example, and also for an initial condition that may not be differentiable at a point, at a single point alone, Riemann problem is your example. So it serves as an example for two of these cases. Now, yeah, a question to you. And now we have seen monotonicity and being not differentiable at a point alone. So with that into consideration, this is a question. So can converging and diverging characteristics occur together for the same equation? Say A or C. You can consider any of these equations because they are non-linear. So only in those cases we'll have either converging or diverging. Only in the nonlinear cases there is a possibility for us to have converging and diverging characteristics. For linear cases it's not possible at all. For nonlinear case it's possible to have converging and diverging characteristics. So the question is, for nonlinear equations, you consider either of the two equations, say A or C. For those equations, can converging and diverging characteristics occur together? That is, we have seen the cases where at a point we had diverging characteristics, and here we had converging characteristics at a point. On the other hand, I'm asking whether you can have both converging and diverging characteristics around the same point. So that is what I'm asking here. For the same problem, can you have both converging and diverging characteristics? I mean, you have to think about it with respect to the convexity of flux. This is a question in your assignment. You can think about it. So next, we have discussed all of these to say how Riemann problem is a special example. I mean, it is a special initial condition for the Euler system of equations. Not just for the Euler system, it's a special example for any scalar equation or any system of equations, because it's easy to study Riemann problem, because it's less complicated compared to any general initial condition. So we are first trying with Riemann problem. I mean, we are first trying to see whether there can exist a proper exact solution for a Riemann problem. So let's consider a Riemann problem now. So which is again, this is one dimensional. So this is your x-axis, okay? And this is a one-dimensional problem, so we won't be considering any changes in y direction. So on one side we have high pressure, we have some point x naught, there we have constructed a diaphragm, and to the left of the diaphragm we have high pressure gas, and to the right of the diaphragm we have low pressure gas. And as the diaphragm ruptures, there will be movement from the left to right, the fluid will start moving. So then, because we have high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other side, there is a possibility for the occurrence of shock and expansion waves. So a shock wave will move towards right, uh, and a contact discontinuity will also move towards right, and an expansion wave will move this side, towards left. So this is a problem. And here, these shock and expansion waves can be governed by either equations A or C, and this contact discontinuity is governed by B. Now, this solution for this problem can be obtained only until the waves don't interact with each other. I mean, we have given the title for this as simple waves. That is, when we say simple waves, we mean that two different waves which are governed by two different equations don't interact with each other. That is, we say that shock and contact discontinuity won't interact. They are all separated by some constant states. It's like there's a constant state over here. Let's say this as U contact right, U contact left. This is U left and U right. So these are the solution for U is constant in all these regions. The solution will vary only across these shocks, contact and expansion waves. Here the variation is smooth. For expansion wave the variation is smooth, so this is not a discontinuity. But there is still a variation. I mean, to the left of the expansion wave the state is constant, and to the right of it also the state is constant. So only across these waves there is some change in solution. And also these waves don't interact. This is an assumption this is known as the simple waves assumption. In this case, we can solve each of these equations A, B and C separately. I mean, although we have U in both the equations, we have U here as well. Although the solution is interdependent on all the three equations, we can solve each of them separately by assuming that the effect of one won't there won't be an effect of one wave on another wave. So this is known as the simple wave assumption. With this assumption, we can obtain the solution only for such a case. When the shock wave moves, the shock wave over here will move, of course, more to the right and then hit this wall and it may turn. In that case, we can't obtain exact solutions properly. Even in this case, that in the picture that I have drawn, obtaining an exact solution is it's not an easy job. We have some iterative schemes to proceed with for finding the exact solution. So for solving just a simple Riemann problem, that is, this is not a general initial condition, right? This is some specific initial condition where the state is constant on either sides of the discontinuity. Even for such an initial condition, to solve the characteristic form of Euler's equations, we need to assume simple waves, and then we need to go on with some iterative schemes to find the exact solution for this problem. So yeah. Now these are certain things that I want to just say. These can be inferred from gas dynamics relations. If you have done gas dynamics, then you would have come across these things earlier itself. But you may come across these things when you do gas dynamics later. So across a shock wave, in your Euler's equations, these are your basic variables, rho, u and p. U can be written as normal and tangential velocity for a 2D case. For 1D case, you only have normal velocity. So across, I'm just writing what all changes across a shock wave, because I have said that states are constant here and here, but the value for your solution changes in this region, in the small shock wave region. Same happens in the contact discontinuity as well. Same happens in this expansion region as well. So what all changes and how these variables change across each of these waves is what we are going to see now. So across a shock wave, all the three variables, velocity, pressure and density, will experience a jump, and normal velocity will decrease and pressure and density will increase. That is, when you have a shock wave, consider it to be steady, okay? And you have some movement across the shock wave. That is, a particle from the left of the shock wave goes through the shock and then goes outside of the shock. So as it goes through the shock and then it goes outside, right? This I'm just considering one single particle. As the particle travels through the shock, normal velocity will decrease and its pressure and density will increase. This is for a specific particle that I'm talking. And we are in the frame of, we are sitting on the shock. That is, as I said, it's steady. We are actually, your frame of reference is on the shock. We are sitting on the shock and then analyzing it. It's just when we consider in that case, your particle on the left, as it moves to the right, it will experience jump in these variables. And across the shock wave, as we have already seen, Rankine-Hugoniot conditions apply. We have seen it for scalar conservation laws. So these conditions apply. Then across an expansion wave, we have a smooth transition. It's not a discontinuity. We have seen it already. And it's just the reverse. Normal velocity will increase and then pressure and density will decrease. So there is something known as generalized Riemann invariance. So like Rankine-Hugoniot conditions for shock waves, we have something known as generalized Riemann invariance for expansion waves. So across an expansion wave, these conditions will apply. And across a contact discontinuity, pressure and normal velocity, they don't change. Only density will change. So across the contact discontinuity, both Rankine-Hugoniot conditions and generalized Riemann invariance apply. That is, Rankine-Hugoniot conditions are for shock waves, and for expansion waves, there are generalized Riemann invariance. For contact discontinuity, both of these apply. So now that we have seen a specific Riemann problem, that is, we have seen a high pressure on one side, low pressure on the other side. That is, on the left we had expansion wave, middle contact, and on the right we had a shock wave. And all the intermediary states were constant. So there are some variants for the same problem. That is, this is the problem that I've told. That is, on the right we have shock. This is a shock, and in the middle there is a contact, and on the left we have expansion waves. These blue lines are expansion waves. So now we can have different variants of the problem. That is, we can have a shock on the left, contact in the middle, and expansion wave on the right. Or otherwise, we can have two expansion waves separated by a contact, or we can have two shock waves separated by a contact. So now we have formulated the Riemann problem, and we have seen some features of the Riemann problem. That is, we talked about the simple waves assumption, and we also mentioned about the iterative schemes to be used along with the simple waves assumptions to find the exact solution for the Riemann problem. So even for this, we don't have a closed form analytical solution. Riemann problem is just a simplified initial condition. Even for this, we don't have a closed form analytical solution for 1D Euler's equations. For scalar equations, we saw the solutions already. But when we go to systems, a simple example for systems is 1D Euler's equations. And in that, when we consider a simple initial condition, that is a Riemann problem, even for that, we don't have a closed form analytical solution. So for this also, for this itself, we need iterative schemes and simple waves assumption. This is some crucial assumption, right? That the waves are not overlapping or interacting with each other, but they may overlap. So this also is an assumption. So with this assumption, we can find the exact solution. For the exact solution, you can look at this book. I have not gone through the exact solution for Riemann problem. So you can refer to this book for the exact solution for one Riemann problem for 1D Euler's equations. So this is it. With this, now we have completed PD. That is, we have seen how, how finding the solution is difficult for 1D Euler's equations, even for a simple Riemann problem. So with this as a motivation, we move on to CFD, where we use numerics to find the solution. So for scalar conservation laws, all the analytical methods were easy, but when we move to systems, doing analytical methods becomes quite difficult. So this is when we need to go to CFD. That is, so now to introduce CFD, it's a recently developed field and it just began in 1960s, and proper working in the field started in 70s, and good contributions to research were given in 80s and 90s. So also the developments in CFD, that is algorithm, I mean, when you say research contributions, people develop some numerical methods to solve some specific type of problem. So that has happened in 80s and 90s. So this development, that is development of numerical methods, so this has coincided with the development of computational power. As and when we have more computational facilities, we started developing more CFD algorithms to solve different problems. So other than CFD, we have analytical or theoretical fluid dynamics and experimental fluid dynamics. To study any system, we use either analytical approach or go to experimental methods. Before CFD, these were the only two techniques available. Now we have CFD as well. So the difficulties in theoretical approach are the following. We have system of PDEs. We have talked about it extensively. They are nonlinear. This also causes some difficulties, and the system of equations are coupled. So these are some major problems. And fluid flow happens in a big region or big domain. So in that domain, in some regions, your flow may be hyperbolic. That is, your system of equations may behave, your system of PDEs may have a hyperbolic nature in some region of the flow, and in some other region it may have elliptic nature, and in some other region parabolic nature, and so on. So your nature of the flow will will vary in different regions itself. So the mathematical nature of your system can change in different regions of the flow. Of a single problem, you can have, in a single problem, you can have different types of PDEs. And then we have physical and mathematical stiffness. That is, we have convection and diffusion coupled together, and convection chemical reaction coupled together. That is, the time and length scale for convection is different from the time and length scale for diffusion. Diffusion is a slow process compared to convection. So to capture both of them in a single equation is itself a difficult process, because when you consider always you have scales, you have to work on some scale, but when you are in the convective scale, you will lose you will have a large time step. In that case, you will lose diffusion. When you are in the diffusive scale, is you'll be able to capture convection, because diffusion is a slow process. When you have low delta T, you will be able to capture both convection and diffusion. So because of this mathematical and physical stiffness, you will have complexities. And then other complexities like turbulence, chemical reactions, geometric complexities. That all of, proper theoretical fluid dynamics has been developed for the simple geometries with assumptions like inviscid irrotational flow. We have this potential flow theory. That's a good fluid dynamic theory, which assumes irrotational flow, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure if it's irrotational. It's inviscid, I guess.
I guess it's irrotational also.
Irrotational. Yeah.
Velocity potential. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you have a lot of assumptions going in the potential flow theory. In also we have inviscid fluid dynamics, which considers Euler's equation only, that is without the viscous terms. That also involves a lot of assumptions. So when you develop, when you do something analytically, we bring in a lot of assumptions, and also geometric complexities. With simple geometry only, we'll be able to do things only with simple geometries. So this is a major problem with theoretical fluid dynamics. Then going on to experimental, it's expensive first, then time consuming, because you have to build up the setup, you have to construct everything from scratch, and then you know doing things will take time. Also, it's difficult, it may be dangerous, there may be some reactions, high heat, many things may happen. Sometimes it may be impossible when you want to do galactic fluid flow phenomena, it may not be possible. And of course, not portable. And when you when you build a setup, you will put in some factors like your parameters will be fixed, some of your parameters will be fixed, so that will lead you to having only some specific form of information depending on those fixed parameters only. But in CFD, we can easily change the parameters because we are writing the code and we can easily change the parameters, and then we can study the system under different conditions. In case of experimental setups, you cannot do it so easily. You need to construct everything from scratch again. So an alternative to these is CFD. So these are some components. These are the steps, in fact, in doing CFD. When you have some domain, you discretize it by grid generation, because all your fluid flow phenomena happen in a continuous domain. You cannot actually solve for all the points. So you need to choose only certain points in the domain, and you find the values of find your solution only on those points. So you discretize your domain using grid generation. Next is equation discretization. That is in your all your governing equations are PDEs. So they are continuous. Now you already have discretized the domain on certain points. Now PDEs won't be applicable on these points. Discrete domain, on the discrete domain, PDEs cannot be applicable. So you need to make them into algebraic equations by considering some approximations. The partial derivatives need to be approximated into something else, like in algebraic format, to enable you to solve it easily. Okay. Next, after doing these two discretizations, you will find some numerical method to solve these equations. After the equation discretization, you will have some algebraic equations. Now you need to solve those algebraic equations using some numerical method. So that is the third step. Now all of these must be fed into the computers using programming, some language of your choice. Then after doing this, you will be able to solve the problem. You can find your solution on all the points that you have obtained during domain discretization. Now you can post process the results using either of these. There are various post processing softwares available, so you can use different types of plots. There are more contour vector plots, etc. There are more plots than these. So yeah, you can process the results. Then the thing is, after post processing the results, we'll get to see how the solution is evolving over time with respect to space and everything. So you will find the solution at all the discretized points. Now why are you doing all of this? That is, you essentially want to see how the solution behaves only to design something. That is, you first fix some coefficients, you fix some parameters of, that is, these design parameters must be fixed initially, and then you formulate all of these. That is, the design parameters will go into equation itself. So in the PDEs you will have the design parameters. So in the equation discretization, you will eventually convert those into algebraic equations. So you start with some design parameters, you go through all of these process and then find the solution for that specific design parameter. That is for the design parameter that you have started with initially. And then after you see how the solution behaves, if you're satisfied with it, those design parameters are okay. If the solution is not good, then you have to change the design parameters and then do the process again. So this is what people do in design. So this kind of thing is used, the same thing is being done in both theoretical and experimental fluid dynamics as well. To design something, you need to go through all of these processes. That is, you need to see how the solution behaves for some for some specific design parameters. And then if you're comfortable with that solution, those design parameters that you have chosen are fine, and then you can go on with the further processes. But if your solution is not okay, then you go about changing the design parameters and then do the same thing until you get a proper solution. So this is what is done in industries. Uh, like we won't be doing all of these things. What we'll be doing is we'll be going through the first three things. That is, domain discretization will not be dealt in detail. We'll just see how the types of domain discretization and all. Essentially, we'll be dealing with equation discretization and numerical methods to solve the algebraic equations. So, because this is what is the CFD research part happens here. The development of algorithms and all. This will be used by industries. This is required for everybody because even when you develop some algorithms, you need to see whether it is good or not. So you need to go through these procedures. So now on to domain discretization. First is grid generation. We have this different types of grids known as structured and unstructured grids. Structured grids are something like, we can have uniform grids, which uniform grids, that is here we have some delta x and some delta y. So this is some, or else you can have delta y equals delta x as well. This is a uniform grid. If you have a different delta y, then it's a structured grid. And also, we can have 2D quadrilateral. In 2D, we can have quadrilaterals like this, the one shown over here. And 3D, we can have hexahedrons. For unstructured grids, we can have triangles and tetrahedrons. Here, I've shown some structured grid over an airfoil. So this is a C grid. This, if you look at this profile, it almost is like C. There's no closure on the other side. It's a C grid because of this reason. And as and when you move close to the airfoil, the grids become the grid also becomes finer. When it's farther away, the grids, you take a coarse grid, and when you move close to any structure, you have a finer grid. Because near the structure, you'll have some complex fluid flow phenomena happening. Here we'll have boundary layer effect, and here we'll have wake phenomena. So to capture all of that, we take a finer grid near the airfoil, and as and when you move farther away, you make the grid coarser. Then this is an O grid. This is also around a different type of airfoil. So here the grid is complete. You have a full O around the airfoil, and here as well, as you move close to the airfoil, you have a finer grid, and as you move far away, you have coarse grid. This is an unstructured triangular grid over an airfoil. I mean, the difference between structured and unstructured is that, you can follow you can have some pattern in structured grid. That is, there is a single line here that goes, even in the horizontal direction, you can trace a single line continuously. This is your pattern of the grid. All the horizontal, all of these lines over here are have the shape of C, and all the these lines are almost normal to the sea everywhere. So you can trace a line. Even in this thing, you were able to trace a line. Here, it's not so. There's no such pattern over here. You just form triangles randomly. But when you move closer to the airfoil, you make the triangles small. That is fine. And when you are far away from the airfoil, you make it coarser. And next is this as well is a grid. Here you have both structured and unstructured type. Here, in these regions, you can trace a single line completely. But here, in some regions over here, that is, in these regions, we have some triangles here and there. So it's a mix of both structured and unstructured grids. Now, the main thing about grid is they influence the quality of solution. That is, when you have more finer grids, your solution may improve. But we have something known as grid independence test and all. It is, you make the grid more and more finer and see if the solution remains the same after making the grid finer. So only such solutions are valid because you test some numerical method that you have developed. And when you do that, you need to do this grid independence test. That is when you show that some solution is final. People will accept it only if you have this grid independence test. I mean, this is something more advanced. So apart from the structured and unstructured grid, we have adaptive grids too. That is, for one time step, you can have a grid, and for the next time step, you can change your grid. So you can have some equation and see how the solution evolves. That is, for one time step, you have a grid and find the solution. And if you think that the solution may require more finer grid, then for the next time step, you can make the grid more finer, depending on the solution for your previous time step. So that way you can make your grid change over time, and it can also change it. I mean, in different regions of the space, you can have different type of grid, and it can also change over time. That's known as adaptive grids. So, in fact, grid generation itself can be taken as one full course. So, I have not gone through grid generation properly. My area of concern is this equation discretization and numerical methods only. So, next we'll see this thing known as equation discretization. So here we have the PDEs and we discretize the PDEs into some algebraic equations. So that is the motive. So for that we have different methods known as finite difference, finite volume, finite element, and spectral methods. So in finite difference method, we use the derivatives in PDEs will be replaced by finite differences. And these are based on points or modes. I mean, we will see all of these in detail. For now, it's just an introduction to each of these. The next is finite volume method. This uses finite volumes. I mean, it is, in finite difference, things are, you'll still have some kind of discretization happening. Okay. Your domain is somewhat discretized like this, and your variables will be stored at some points here and there. So this finite difference discretization, that is when the theory of converting the derivatives into finite differences is based on these points. Whereas in finite volume method, you replace the derivatives into something else by using the theory for finite volumes, by considering that these are some volumes. And in these volumes, information will be stored either at the cell center or at the cell vertex. But its finite volume is done by considering the fact that this whole thing is a volume. Then after that consideration, we use integral form of conservation law. We have seen integral form of conservation law some time back. That is, any differential form is actually derived from the integral. It's derived from the, you consider some material volume and then you obtain the conservative equations, that is mass, momentum and energy equations. Then you from that form you get the differential form, and upon the differential form, if you integrate the differential form over some control volume, then it becomes an integral form. So all of these things, the theory for finite volume method is developed upon this integral form of conservation law. We won't consider either PDE or the weak form. We'll use the integral form here, and the solutions here are cell integral averages. That is, we have finite volumes. These volumes are known as cells, and solutions for each cell is an average. That is, we take an average of all U at each and every point in this cell, and that is your solution. That is the solution that you obtain out of this finite volume method. And also this enables discrete conservation. That is, your PDE is in conservative form. That is, your variables are conserved, mass, momentum and energy are conserved. When you look at the PDE, we can say that mass, momentum and energy are conserved. That is, if you consider some volume, any change in any rate of change of a rate of change of any quantity inside that volume is equal to the flux of that quantity going across the surface of that volume. That is known as conservation. Here, finite volume method inherently has discrete conservation. It is in each of these finite volumes there is conservation. So this quality of FVM makes it significant for solving fluid flow problems, because fluid flow problems inherently has conservative equations, and fluid flow phenomena follows conservation. So as finite volume method has discrete conservation, it becomes a good choice for solving fluid flow phenomena. Next is finite element method. This uses weak form of conservation law. We have seen weak form. That is, we use test function to convert the PDE into weak form. And then for this weak form, they use shape functions or interpolation functions. That is, the test functions that we used are also like shape functions only. That is, your shape functions are some test functions. Then we have something known as spectral methods. So yeah, these are the main methods used in equation discretization. So now first let us see finite difference method, the basics of finite difference method, and then we'll move on to finite volume method. So yeah, have you come across finite difference method before?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So then this is going to be, I've just shown the forward difference, central difference, and these things only. So these are certain things that you'll already be knowing only. So here I've just shown some basic finite differences. So as you have some X position space, and then this is a continuous space. You discretize it. That is, you you consider certain points on this position space. This way you discretize it. Then you do a Taylor series expansion about any point, say x. So in this position space. Then to evaluate your solution at x plus delta x, this is your Taylor series expansion. This is your u at x comma t plus delta x and your derivative at x comma t, then your second derivative at x comma t, and it goes on. This is your standard Taylor series expansion, and each of these terms over here can be expressed as xj and xj plus 1. That is here when you say uj n, j here represents spatial points. That is xj plus 1 is xj plus delta x, and n here represents the temporal values, which is governed by this equation, that is Tn plus 1 equals Tn plus delta t. So now we can write each of these terms in this format. So doing that, your this term will become uj plus 1n, and this becomes ujn, and these are just the same thing repeated. So now yeah, your dou u by dou xj here is can be written as this thing minus of these quantities. So now this is of order delta x, that is your first term here the first term here is multiplied by delta x. So your error, these terms will be truncated, right? So your truncation error is of order delta x, and this is your approximation of dou u by dou x. So now this is known as the forward difference in space, and this forward difference in space is a first order approximation. So now going to backward difference, that is u of x minus delta x comma t. I mean, in first we expanded about we expanded everything about x comma t, but we solved for u of x plus delta x. Here now we are solving for u of x minus delta x.
U of j plus 1 minus u of j. Over there, n plus 1 is written.
Where?
The blue, the final equation in blue. It's j plus 1, the difference formula. U of j plus 1 of n minus u of j and n. The one in blue, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So next, going to this one, backward difference. So here again you expand things about x comma t for u of x minus delta x, and then you write in terms of j minus 1 n and in terms of j and n. So here again you do the same thing to get this, and here as well your first truncation error is first term in the truncation is multiplied by delta x. So this as well is a first order approximation in space, and this is known as backward difference. So now if you subtract 1 and 2, this is your second equation, it is your backward difference equation, and this is the equation that you wrote for getting forward difference. You subtract those, you will get something known as central difference, that is as in when you do this, your first term will be of order delta x cube. So now when you divide it by delta x, your first term will be of order delta x squared. So that central difference is a second order approximation space. Now when you add the two equations, you will get something known as central difference for second order derivatives. So all of these were first order derivatives, that is all of these difference operators were approximation of your first order derivative. Now we will try to get a difference operator for second order derivative. So in that case you add 1 and 2. When you do this addition, you will get something like this. Here your first term is of order delta x power 4, and in order to get this you need to divide it by delta x squared. So this becomes of order delta x squared, and you get something like this. So this is your central difference for second order derivative in space, and this is a second order approximation. So now the same thing, all of this has been done for your space. Now you can do it for time. It is you can have forward in time, backward in time, central in time, everything. So here I have just shown forward difference in time. So this is your Taylor series expansion about t for getting u at t plus delta t. So here again you replace these by j and n plus 1 etc. So you get something like this, and you get this final expression. This is a forward difference in time, and this is first order again. Similarly, backward difference in time is second order in time, and central difference is second order in time. So these finite differences are actually used to replace the derivatives in your PDE. So now depending on the type of difference, so for in an equation in a PDE, you have multiple derivative terms. So each of those terms can be written as any of these difference operators. That is, your same dou u by dou x can be written in either forward difference form or in central difference form or in backward difference form. So depending on in which form you write, you get different finite difference schemes, and each of these will have different accuracy and stability properties. So yeah, so let us see something like FTCS for a linear convection equation. So this is your linear convection equation where C is some constant. Have you gone through accuracy and stability analysis before?
Not exactly, ma'am, but like for accuracy, if we had the standard 5-point formula was more accurate than diagonal 5-point, like that's what we had learned. And with respect to stability, for wave equations, for wave equations, I guess the condition alpha c greater than 1, less than 1, or something of that way gives a stable equation. That's what we had, like just the basic condition.
Okay, fine. Yes. So here, this is a linear convection equation, and first let's try FTCS, that is forward in time and central in space. So let's just approximate this equation by these finite difference operators. So now for these, let us try to do stability analysis. So let's see the one. First of all, yeah, before doing stability analysis, let's see something known as modified PDE or equivalent PDE for the finite difference equation. So this is now a finite difference approximation of our PDE. So for this now, after writing this finite difference approximation, we can expand each of these further. That is, we have obtained each of these from considering Taylor series approximation only. Now let us try to write each of these in terms of Taylor series equation. That is, accuracy analysis is actually done in this way. That is, we can straight away say that this is of order delta t, and this approximation is of order delta x squared. However, there is something known as modified PDE or equivalent PDE. For this equation, it's quite simple to just say it. But sometimes you don't actually represent each of these by some known differences. Instead, you can have something just random. That is, now I can replace this uj by half into uj plus 1 n plus half into uj minus 1 n. Like this way you can formulate a different scheme. So for any just random scheme like this, that is here it's already evidently known that this is going to be of order delta t and of order delta x squared. But for any random equation like this, you do a modified PDE analysis to see your accuracy. That is, you see to see which, I mean, of which order your parameters delta t and delta x are in this equation. So now let me just show it for this simple equation. You will eventually see that it's going to be of order delta t and delta x squared only, but how to do it through modified PDE is what we are going to see. So uj n plus 1 can be written as uj n plus delta t dou u by dou t plus and so on. Then you have this minus uj n. So this way you expand each of these terms in you expand each of these terms further again using Taylor series. So when you do this, these will go off. Of course, order delta x cube will remain, they'll get added. So, and then you divide this as well. So here you'll again get back the same thing. So this is the actual equation that you're solving for. And some term of order delta x squared. So this is the actual equation that you're solving. So this way you can, from any given finite difference equation, you can get back to the modified PDE by expanding each of these terms about using Taylor series expansion, and then you can get your original PDE plus some other terms. So this way, this is your actual PDE, and this is the truncation error, and this is known as the modified PDE, this equation, modified or equivalent PDE. So in this equation, if you make delta t go to 0 and delta x go to 0, you must get your original PDE. This is something known as the consistency condition. Only then, if this happens, then you say that your PDE, your difference equation is consistent with your PDE. If not, then your difference equation is not consistent with your PDE. Suppose if this were not true, then your difference equation that you're considering is not consistent with your PDE. So this is known as consistency. So any scheme is a good scheme only if it is consistent with the actual PDE that you're solving for. If not, then you're actually not solving your PDE itself. It is, suppose if I say that I'm replacing this by something else, then let's see if it's consistent. So now I'm trying to replace this by half into uj plus 1 n plus uj minus 1n. That way, let us see whether it is consistent. Will it be consistent?
You'll get a constant out if you remove that. The C term won't be there for dou u by dou x.
Where?
Ma'am, since we get a constant out here, half, if you use the central difference formula. Yeah, so the C term would not be there for dou u by dou x. No, we can take that as common. No?
Yeah.
So then it won't be like, I'm not sure, consistent.
Yeah, we can expand each of these and then we'll get something like minus half plus C.
Yeah.
Then it won't be consistent, yes. So this way, here for a PDE, we have used the usual finite difference operators, that is forward in time and central in space, and then we have done this modified PDE thing. But in general, we don't construct any scheme from the PDE itself. We don't actually do this construction right away from the PDE. If you go for complex equations, then this is not usually done. So in that case, to see whether your approximate equation is consistent with your PDE, you have to go through this analysis and then check. So this is the condition for that. So this is one consistency. So with this modified PDE thing, you can check for consistency and accuracy as well, both of these. So you use this modified PDE to check both. For stability, you need to go through von Neumann stability analysis. For simple, this is possible only for linear equations. So for simple equations and for simple PDEs and simple difference equations, you can go through von Neumann stability analysis to see if your scheme will be stable. That is, the round of error produced in your algorithm, will it grow or will it be bounded? So that is what will be checked in von Neumann stability analysis. So here, let's rewrite this FTCS. Let's do it for FTCS itself. So for this, okay, your U is actually the U that you get from this equation is the exact solution for your finite difference equation. This is different from the solution N, let's call it N. This is the solution that you get from computer. For this finite difference equation itself, uj will have infinite number of decimal points. So that will be approximated by the computer to finite number, that is nj. So this is your approximate solution for finite difference equation again. So I'll write uj as nj plus epsilon j. So epsilon is the error. So this case, U follows FTCS, that is, this is your finite difference equation. Now if you substitute this into your first equation, you will get so and if you look at it carefully, the order for epsilon j is different. So let's say order for epsilon j is some 10 power minus some a, okay, and from this equation let's just take those terms separately. So now each of them must individually be 0 because they are of different orders. So say this is of order say 10 power minus a and this is of order 1, then this must individually be 0 and this must individually be 0. So we have two different equations from here, each of them going to 0 individually. So this way you have obtained some equation for the evolution of your error from your FTC, from your scheme itself. You have obtained an expression for the evolution of error. This is the evolution of round off error actually. So this is possible, that is your error equation itself is like FTCS only. So this is possible only for linear schemes. Suppose you have had some uj multiplying over here, then this will not be possible. That is, in that case you will have nj epsilon j, nj into epsilon j terms coming up. So your it will be difficult to separate things out and write a separate evolution equation only in terms of round off error. Here all the terms are error only. We don't have any nj's coming up in this error equation. So this is possible only when your scheme is linear. And then so for your evolution, using this evolution equation, you see how the error evolves over time. That is, you can now say that this you do Fourier transform for this error equation. That is, any ej of n can be written as e of t into use e power minus I kx. This is sum of different m components, of course. When you substitute this into your evolution equation, you will get some sum, and then will be e of t plus delta t minus e of t both of them multiplied by So now when you substitute this approximation into this evolution equation, you get this equation. So now you have different m components. This is here again, each of these terms in this summation should be equal to 0 separately. So the summation will go off. You need not write a summation because each of the terms, summation is just repetition of the same terms, that is these same terms for different values of n. Now each of those must be equal to 0 separately. So in that case you get to write a separate equation without this summation. Now dividing this whole thing by e power minus ik delta x, and then let's just divide this whole thing by e of t e power minus ikm x. Okay. I'm taking this t on the other side. So you get this equation. So now this is your amplitude ratio. This is how error varies over time. That is, this is the ratio between your error at t plus delta t by error at with respect to error at t. So let me call it as sum a. So now a will be 1 minus, let me call this as lambda, and this is going to be minus 2i sine km delta x, right? So yeah, is this correct? So this is your amplitude ratio. So in order for your system to be stable, you require your mod A to be less than 1. So in that case, this term must be less than 1. So you just write 1 plus 2 lambda, right? Modulus of this must be less than 1. So which will be 1 plus that is minus 1 less than this. Is both, I mean, is there any doubt? Is it okay? And any doubts?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So now you have these two inequalities. So considering each of these separately, so you have minus 2 less than 4 lambda squared km delta x. On the other side, you have 4 lambda squared sine squared km delta x less than 0, right? So here you want the quantity on the left to be less than 0. So this is possible if the maximum of this quantity is less than 0, then all of the other quantities will obviously be less than 0. So I'm writing a maximum of 4 lambda squared. So if maximum of this is less than 0, obviously others will be less than 0. So maximum of this can occur only when this is exactly 1. This sine squared is exactly 1. The maximum possible for this term is 1 only. That is sine squared km delta x is 1 only. So yeah, you write 4 lambda squared into 1 less than 0. So the condition is lambda less than 0. Is it? But what is your lambda? It is c delta t by delta x. So unless your c is positive, this cannot be, c is negative, this cannot, lambda cannot be less than 0. This is one side. So for stability, we require lambda to be less than 0 from one side. So that is not possible if your c is positive. And here what do we infer is making it other way. So can this be possible? You are getting something like this. Will this be possible? Because sine squared km delta x is always going to be positive. 1 by 2 is always positive. So this is this is possible. It has to be greater than minus lambda squared. Both are positive, so this will always be positive and this will always be negative. But this is always going to be greater than minus lambda squared only. So this is FTCS, right? We have done it for FTCS. Did we miss some sign somewhere? So you should get something like both of the conditions will not be possible for FTCS, but
Ma'am, it had to be sine hyperbolic, right? E
Sine-
power, e power
Yeah.
minus, sine hyperbolic.
Is it? E
Uh,
power
minus I theta, sine ht, right?
is cos theta plus I sine theta. Right?
Okay, sorry, yeah. That way,
Yeah.
yeah, then it's right. That part is right.
Okay. Modulus of a complex number is, let's say, if you have a plus ib, it's going to be a square root of a squared plus b squared, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this is correct. So even if we have, even if we take positive over here, we'll get reverse and we'll have a plus here. And this may be a minus, this will be a minus. But of course, this will be the same for both of these.
Ma'am, we'll have to have a root of 1 plus 4 lambda square.
Where?
Modulus will be root of 1 plus 4 lambda square sine square km delta x, right?
Here it's a root.
Yeah. So then on squaring, we'll just get one of the inequality, right?
Yeah. So the other one goes. So this leads to a possibility. I mean, this leads to a positive. So the other one goes, yes. We cannot square when the signs are opposite. Right?
Yeah.
We
Ma'am, how
can
if we just take it separately and then do it?
take, yeah. Take which of these separately? I'm not getting it.
Ma'am, like take root of 1 plus whatever is there in less than 1 as one condition.
Yeah.
And then again greater than minus 1 as 1. But on squaring, you'll get again one single condition of
Mm.
no, one will be greater than 1 will be less than 1 on
This,
squaring.
on squaring, the sign here will reverse,
Yeah.
right? So yeah.
Yeah, will be a
So,
single condition in the end.
so everything will reverse. But yeah, this is going to be a positive sign. This is a positive. When you square, when you have two numbers a and b both being positive, when you say minus a is less than b,
Then only minus a that time the sign will change. No?
uh, we don't know.
Yeah. We cannot say that. Yeah, true.
Suppose if minus b is this one and minus a is this one, then a will be here. In this case,
Yeah,
a
ma'am, that won't be possible.
squared. On the other way, a squared may be less than b squared. Yeah. So in this itself, we'll have two possibilities. Let's just look at the other one where we have a proper person. Like here it's correct, less than 0. So we have taken the maximum. And this will be possible for C less than 0. But however, yeah, both of them should lead you to unstable. That is, whatever the condition you put in, you'll get the result as unstable. We'll do it properly next time.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So in CFD, what all you guys have studied before? No, in finite difference method. So I can plan accordingly.
Ma'am, we had the Laplace equation, and for that, solving that, we had they had taught us the standard 5-point formula and diagonal 5-point formula method. Then for heat equation and wave equation, we had the Schmidt method and one more. I'm not recalling that. These were like what they taught, and it was all basic questions with just drawing the grids and plotting the values, and then like getting the other values with the help of some initial condition.
So with regard to consistency and all, have you studied something earlier?
No, ma'am. Nothing exactly. Not even the one Newman stability analysis.
Okay, fine. So we'll go through all of these properly for all FTCS, FTBS, and FTFS. Yeah. For linear convection equation. Then we'll move on to upwind schemes and all. Based on stability, we'll see how upwinding can be done. We'll go through this. So have you looked at the assignments?
Yes, ma'am, but haven't started solving it. It's a little hectic these days.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So if you have any doubts, you can contact me anytime. So yeah, we'll probably have the next class by the 3rd week of July because I have an exam coming up.